Today, we are opening the files on a case that, well, it really captivated two continents. It's a story involving an international move, a deeply troubled second marriage, a really desperate custody struggle.
And it all culminates in this incredibly violent, fatal assault. It took place in a quiet North Carolina home back in the summer of 2015.
Yeah, it's a devastating story. And the legal battle that followed, almost as protracted, almost as brutal in its own way.
Definitely. We're talking about a fight for justice that stretched nearly a decade. Starting with the death in 2015, going through trials, appeals.
And finally ending with a highly controversial release just this year in 2024.
Exactly.
Our subject is Jason Corbett. He was an Irish father of two, killed in his own home in America. Now, when the police arrived, they were met with, well, what seemed like a clear narrative.
Presented by his wife, Molly Martens, and her father, Thomas Martens.
Right, the story was self-defense. They claimed Jason was volatile, abusive.
But as we started digging into the source material, the police reports, court filings, the forensic evidence, the scene itself told a profoundly different story.
A deeply calculated one, it seems.
Well, what really stands out when you look at all the documentation is this extraordinary clash of narratives.
Mm-hmm.
On one side, you've got the defense, and it's led by Thomas Martens, a former FBI agent, claiming, necessity defense of his daughter.
But then on the other side, the prosecution had this mountain of forensic evidence. Evidence that suggested the scene was altered, and a clear motive already existing, focusing on control, custody, money.
Yeah.
So our mission today is pretty clear. We are going to unpack every nugget of knowledge we can find in these sources. We need to analyze, the psychological stuff Molly Martens was reportedly doing.
The alleged manipulation.
Exactly. And her husband Jason's secret plans to finally escape, to go back to Ireland. And critically, we need to look at the microscopic forensic evidence that just, systematically dismantled the defense's claims.
Which is what ultimately forced them into that plea deal, right? After their first conviction was overturned.
Right.
And for you, the listener, I think understanding this case means appreciating its strategic complexity. Thomas Martens wasn't just, an emotional father reacting. He was a law graduate.
It's a key detail.
It really is. The documents show his focus, even right after it happened, was on establishing a legal defense based on his state of mind. And the case is also, frankly, a disturbing look at how young children can be manipulated, weaponized, really, in a deadly custody battle.
So we'll trace this whole exhaustive legal journey. The death in 2015, that 2017 conviction, the appeal in 2021 that gave them a second chance, and then the 2023 plea deal that led to their release just months ago. Okay, let's unpack this then. We need to establish the foundation, understand the dynamics before the tragedy between Jason Corbett, his wife Molly Martens, and the intense involvement of her father, Tom Martens. Let's start with Jason's past, his life back in Ireland.
Okay, so Jason Corbett, he was a successful operations manager, originally from Limerick in Ireland, and he'd already faced, significant tragedy in his life before any of this.
Yeah, his first wife.
Margaret, known as Mags Fitzpatrick, she died very unexpectedly back in 2006. She had a catastrophic asthma attack just months after their daughter Sarah was born.
So suddenly he's a widowed father, raising two very young children, Jack and Sarah, on his own.
Exactly. A really tough situation.
And that detail about how Mags died the asthma attack, that's crucial, isn't it? Because it directly contradicts the story Molly Martens would later try to spin.
Absolutely. It highlights the deception early on. Mags died from a medical event, a severe asthma attack. Not cancer, as Molly claimed, and certainly not, because of anything Jason did.
That's a really important distinction.
Extremely important. So fast forward to 2008. Jason needs help, understandably. He hires Molly Martens, who was 24 at the time, from Tennessee, as an au pair.
So she moves to Ireland to look after the kids.
Right. And the relationship, developed from there. They eventually decided to move together to the U.S., to Lexington, North Carolina, and they got married there in 2011.
Okay, let's talk about the money involved in this move. Because it wasn't insignificant, and it shows Jason's commitment, right? But it also represented, a potential asset pool for Molly.
Oh, the financial commitment was enormous. Jason sold his home in Limerick. He liquidated his life savings, all to buy their new house in Walburg, North Carolina. That cost around U.S. $390,000.
Wow.
Yeah, so he wasn't just buying a house. He was really investing everything in this new life. And the sources say his generosity extended to Molly personally, too.
How so?
Well, he apparently gave her U.S. $80,000 just for furnishings. He bought her a brand new BMW SUV. And maybe most revealing about his desire to kind of blend the families, He contributed U.S. $49,000 towards his father-in-law, Tom Martens' own wedding ceremony.
$49,000 towards his father-in-law's wedding.
That's what the sources indicate, a huge sum.
That level of financial commitment makes the underlying friction about the kid's citizenship even more significant, doesn't it? This wasn't just typical blended family stuff. It sounds like it was about control over their future, their identity.
Precisely. Molly allegedly really wanted to formally adopt Jack and Sarah. She was pushing for them to get American citizenship, to sort of fully integrate them into the Martens family unit.
But Jason resisted.
Repeatedly. And very strongly, according to his family. He applied for their green cards, but specifically through his job, not through the Martens family connection. And he insisted they keep their Irish passports.
Why was that so important to him?
Well, his sister and family confirmed this was deliberate, a strategic precaution, really. Jason apparently feared that if something happened to him, the Martens family would try to stop the children from going back to Ireland, back to their biological family there.
Wow. And if that was his fear, well, the court records kind of suggest he was right to be worried, don't they? Molly was already looking into divorce, custody options, years before he died.
Yeah, that preoccupation with custody seems long-standing. It's documented. Records show she sought legal advice about her rights if they divorced back in 2013. And then again in late 2014.
So long before the incident.
Long before. It shows this clear, persistent focus on securing the children. Not just as a stepmother, but as the legal primary custodian. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment thing.
Okay, here's where it gets, well, really interesting. And frankly, quite disturbing. The documentation seems to paint a picture of Molly Martens as someone who operated within this web of deep, compulsive lying and erratic behavior.
That's certainly the picture painted by Jason's family and the prosecution's evidence.
Which, for the prosecution, obviously fueled the motive argument gaining control.
Exactly. Jason's sister, Tracy Lynch, described Molly as a fantasist. She apparently lied constantly about her background, claiming she was an Olympic swimmer.
Right, I remember reading that.
A qualified Montessori teacher, that she'd previously fostered a boy. These weren't just small white lies, you know. They are presented as elaborate, deep-seated deceptions, maybe designed to elevate her status or credibility.
And the most chilling lies, as you mentioned earlier, were about Jason's late wife, Mags, telling friends they were pen pals, that Mags died of cancer. Why invent those specific things?
It's hard to say for sure, but it looks like a form of psychological manipulation, doesn't it? Maybe trying to insert herself into Jason's past, minimize the real tragedy of Mags' sudden death. More shockingly, she apparently told neighbors, specifically during a Bible study meeting, the sources say that Sarah was her biological daughter.
She described the labor.
Yeah, allegedly recounting a detailed and difficult labor. I mean, it suggests maybe not just insecurity, but, well, a real disconnect from reality regarding her role in the children's lives.
And underneath all this, the sources reveal this serious, undisclosed history of mental health issues.
Yes. Apparently, Martens had been released from a secure psychiatric unit at Emory University Hospital in Georgia just weeks before she even met Jason. And this was something she deliberately concealed until right before their wedding.
Wow.
Yeah. The prosecution later used this to suggest, a history of instability, a capacity for calculated deception.
And beyond the lies, the sources document this increasingly volatile behavior directed at Jason, even the children.
Affidavits detailed several instances that the Corbett family saw as abusive or erratic parenting. One example given was holding Jack's face under a running faucet because he splashed her.
Oh, wow.
And other times where she reportedly became enraged when Jack would tell neighbors the truth that she wasn't his biological mother. The tension really seems to have escalated in the months leading up to the killing.
Jason's sister mentioned a specific incident.
Yeah, she cited a public fat-shaming incident shortly before the killing. She believed that was the last straw for Jason, the moment he realized he absolutely had to leave.
Which brings us to what the family believed was Jason's final plan, the escape.
And perhaps the most sinister aspect, connecting all this alleged manipulation to the motive, was the claim that Molly had secretly told Jack and Sarah that Jason had actually killed their birth mother, Mags.
Did Sarah confirm that?
Sarah Corbett later corroborated that lie, yes. It's devastating. The evidence suggests Jason had finally just reached his breaking point. His sister firmly believed he'd actually packed a bag, intending to return to Ireland for good without Molly on the very night he was killed.
So the stakes were incredibly high for Molly.
Absolutely existential. Losing Jason meant losing the children, the things she had apparently fought so obsessively to control.
Okay, so the narrative of the killing itself. The events of August 2nd, 2015. It's filtered almost entirely through the actions and statements of Thomas Martens, right? Specifically that 911 call.
That call became absolutely central. Thomas Martens, the former FBI agent, he called emergency services at 3 a.m. The call itself was long, nearly 14 minutes.
And what was his initial story?
Dramatic. He claimed he'd intervened in a violent fight, found Corbett strangling Molly in their bedroom, and then he said, quote, "I may have killed him with a baseball bat." He framed it immediately as necessary defense, protecting his daughter.
And Molly's statement brought in the second weapon, the brick.
It did. Molly admitted later that she, too, had tried to hit Jason with a brick during the struggle. She claimed it was just, conveniently located on her nightstand.
Which is interesting in itself. A brick on the nightstand.
It raised questions, definitely, and it showed this dual coordinated use of pretty severe force, which is, well, hard to reconcile with a simple struggle where one person is supposedly being strangled.
But the immediate scene, what police and paramedics found, that fundamentally challenged this neat self-defense story, didn't it?
Yeah.
What did the crime scene actually reveal?
Well, the physical evidence immediately complicated things. Jason was found unresponsive, naked, covered in blood, with just catastrophic head injuries. But crucially, neither Thomas nor Molly Martens had any visible physical injuries.
Despite claiming this life-or-death struggle.
Exactly. In fact, there's a note that when an officer tried to photograph Molly, looking for potential strangulation marks on her neck, he actually had to tell her to stop rubbing and tugging at her own neck.
Suggesting she was trying to create marks.
It certainly suggested she might be trying to simulate injury rather than presenting genuine marks from a struggle.
And the timeline.
Yeah.
Specifically the body temperature. That was the first major piece of physical evidence contradicting their whole story about when this happened, right?
That detail turned out to be incredibly damning. Paramedics arrived really quickly, less than 10 minutes after the 911 call. But despite the supposed intensity of this recent struggle, and Tom Martens claiming he'd just done extensive CPR, they noted Jason Corbett's body temperature was alarmingly cool, significantly lower than you'd expect.
What does that mean, practically?
Well, the cooling of a body, a rigor mortis, it's a relatively predictable process. An alarmingly cool body, less than 10 minutes after a supposed struggle, strongly suggests the incident actually happened much earlier than that 3 a.m. call.
So a delay.
A delay. A window of time where maybe the Martenses had time to compose themselves, maybe confer, maybe even alter the scene before calling 911.
And tying into that suspected delay, what about Tom Martens' demeanor on the phone? I remember reading that the dispatcher found it unusual.
Yes. The experienced 911 agent testified that Tom Martens sounded surprisingly calm throughout that whole 14-minute call. Remember, he's claiming he just wrestled a man, hit him with a bat, performed over 400 chest compressions.
Which should leave anyone breathless, panicked.
Absolutely. Yet the dispatcher noted Martens wasn't panting, wasn't gasping, wasn't showing the usual signs of extreme stress or exertion you'd expect after such a violent event. This sort of calculated calmness really bolstered the prosecution's theory that the call was delayed, maybe even staged.
Okay, and the actions the Martenses took immediately after Jason's death.
Yeah.
They seem to show a clear effort to obscure evidence, control the narrative, not really the actions of shocked people acting in self-defense.
This is where the evidence suggesting calculation, if not outright premeditation, really starts to mount, within hours of being released from police custody. Hours. Molly hired industrial cleaners.
The industrial cleaners.
Yeah. She spent US $5,500 to have the house thoroughly cleaned of blood traces. This immediate, expensive cleaning obviously hampered any further forensic examination of the scene. It denied investigators access to potential evidence on carpets, walls.
And her trying to get Jason cremated so quickly, that also suggests trying to eliminate evidence, doesn't it? Evidence of the trauma to his body.
It certainly looked that way. She apparently attempted to have him cremated immediately before his family could even arrive from Ireland.
That's awful for the family.
Imagine flying across the Atlantic, grieving, only to be told you can only see your loved one's remains, arrange repatriation, if you first sign a legal agreement to pay for the whole funeral and transport costs.
Unbelievable.
And the Corbett family also claimed the Martens actually hired off-duty police officers to physically prevent family members from attending the memorial service held in the U.S. Yeah. It just cemented this perception that the Martenses were actively trying to block access, control every single detail surrounding Jason's death and burial. So while the immediate aftermath focused a lot on the physical evidence, the central conflict really was always the children. And the fight over Jack and Sarah, well, it further solidified the prosecution's arguments about the Martens' underlying motive.
Which brings us right back to Jason's planning, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Confirming his suspicions about Molly's intentions for custody.
It really does. Jason had a will written back in 2007, and he never changed it, even after marrying Molly.
And who did the will name as guardians?
It specifically named his sister, Tracy Lynch, and her husband as the children's legal guardians, which meant, legally, Molly had absolutely no claim to them if Jason died.
But despite that clear legal hurdle, Molly still filed for custody, just days after his death.
Yes, she formally filed for custody of 10-year-old Jack and 8-year-old Sarah, claiming she'd been their sole mother figure for the past 8 years.
How did that go?
Her attempt failed, quickly. On August 20th, 2015, the court dismissed her claim and granted custody to Tracy Lynch, who immediately flew the children back to Ireland.
And the judge in that hearing had some strong words, didn't he?
He did. Judge Brian Shipwash, who presided over the guardianship hearing, later testified on the record. He said he believed Martin showed a deranged entitlement to the children. He was apparently so concerned about her mental state, her potential for future harm, that his main priority was just getting those kids back to Ireland safely and quickly.
Wow. Okay, this part is also critical because it really unveils the manipulation Molly allegedly used against the children, which, ironically, became the very legal technicality that later overturned her conviction.
It's a painful irony. Initially, when the kids were interviewed by social services right after the death, their statements actually sounded favorable to the Martins' self-defense story.
What did they say then?
Sarah apparently claimed Jason had anger issues, had smacked Molly. Jack claimed he'd witnessed physical assault, said his father got angry for no good reason. These statements were immediately seized upon by the defense, obviously.
But once they were back in Ireland, safe with family, the story changed.
Completely. 9 months later, Jack bravely renounced those initial statements. In a follow-up interview, he stated very clearly that Molly had coached him, told him exactly what lies to say before those first interviews.
Why did she tell him to lie?
He said she told him the fabricated stories about abuse would help keep him and Sarah safe. It was a critical turning point, proving the extent of the alleged manipulation.
And even after they were back in Ireland, Molly's obsession with controlling them, connecting with them, continued publicly.
Disturbingly so. For months afterwards, she kept posting photos of Jack and Sarah on social media, often including a U.S. phone number and email address, clearly hoping they'd contact her, trying to maintain some kind of control over their narrative, their connection to her.
Until the family stopped her.
The Corbett family eventually had to send a formal cease and desist letter to force her to stop publishing the children's photos online.
Okay, beyond the custody fight, let's revisit those other kind of strange post-incident details from the early investigation. You mentioned Tom Martens laying groundwork for self-defense in his interviews.
Yes, given his legal background, investigators noted he was very calculated in his police interviews. He kept repeating, almost academically, their state of mind, emphasizing that he and Molly genuinely feared for their lives. It was seen as a clear, early attempt to establish the legal concept of necessity or self-defense even before charges were filed.
And that car crash involving Molly, less than a month after the killing, what did that suggest?
Well, it certainly suggested instability, maybe desperation. August 31st, 2015, Molly crashes her brother's car into a neighbor's brick mailbox in Knoxville. A witness reported she seemed impaired, had glassy eyes, and was just fixated on the children being taken away to Ireland.
Did the police get involved?
No. Instead of calling the police, her parents, Tom and Sharon Martens, arrived quickly. They reportedly worked to cover up the damage themselves. Thomas Martens later privately refunded the mailbox owner, keeping law enforcement out of it. Just another detail suggesting perhaps a pattern of concealment.
Okay, the trial. Starting July 2017, this was really where the emotional narrative of fear collided head-on with the undeniable reality of forensic science. This is where the evidence of excessive force and maybe preparation really seemed to overwhelm the defense claims.
Absolutely. The prosecution's case really centered on the sheer level of violence inflicted, which was just far, far beyond anything that could reasonably be called necessary self-defense.
The post-mortem findings were brutal, weren't they?
Truly horrific. Jason suffered approximately 12, maybe more, blows to the head. The pathologist testified that any 8 of those blows would likely have rendered him unconscious, incapacitated, and that 4 individual strikes were probably enough to cause death on their own.
So multiple fatal blows.
Yes. The force used was so extreme that his skull was too badly shattered for them to even count the exact number of impacts accurately.
That detail alone, the sheer number of blows, kind of destroys the necessity argument, doesn't it?
Yeah.
If your goal is just self-preservation, why keep hitting someone who's already down, already incapacitated?
Exactly. That was a core part of the prosecution's argument. And they used two other key elements to suggest preparation and malice: the financial motive and a chemical element.
Let's talk about the chemical evidence, the
All
trazodone.
right. Toxicology reports confirmed traces of trazodone in Jason's bloodstream. Now, trazodone is a powerful prescription sedative and antidepressant.
And Jason wasn't prescribed it.
Never. Jason had no prescription for this drug. Medical records showed, however, that Molly Martens had received a prescription for trazodone just 3 days before Jason's death.
Wow. The implication there is huge.
Enormous. If Jason was drugged, sedated, even partially incapacitated, he couldn't have effectively fought back or posed the kind of threat the Martenses described. It completely counters the claim that Tom Martens had to intervene in this life-threatening struggle. It points strongly towards, well, premeditation, or at least a planned incapacitation before the fatal assault began.
And speaking of planning, let's explicitly revisit the motive the prosecution put forward. Molly stood to gain financially, and more importantly, she'd get the kids.
That was the argument. While she wouldn't inherit through Jason's will, she would inherit the marital home and all its contents. Plus, she was the beneficiary of a U.S. $600,000 life insurance policy.
$600,000.
Yeah, but above all, the prosecution argued the primary driver was custody. That deranged entitlement the judge mentioned. The financial gain, combined with eliminating the only person blocking her access to the children, that was presented as the clear, compelling motive.
Okay, let's turn to the forensic evidence that really dismantled the standing fight narrative. The blood spatter analysis.
This was probably the most devastating physical evidence against the Martens. Blood spatter analysis lets experts figure out the positions of the victim, the assailant, the force used.
What did it show in this case?
Well, the expert testified that blood spatters were found inside the layers of the quilt and deep into the mattress.
Inside. What does that mean?
It means the first catastrophic blows likely happened while Jason was lying down, maybe asleep, maybe already sedated, because the force needed to drive blood spatter that deep into the bedding requires the head to be pressed against those items when struck.
Which immediately contradicts the defense claim that Tom walked in on a standing, violent strangling.
Precisely, and there was more. The blood spatters found on the inside hem of Thomas Martens' boxer shorts, they painted an even clearer, grimmer picture. That type of low-level spatter suggests the assailant was standing or leaning directly over the victim, with the victim's head already on or very near the floor when those final, crushing blows were struck. It implies Thomas Martens was quite possibly straddling or standing over Jason while delivering massive blows to a man already on the ground, defenseless.
So if the defense was claiming self-defense, how did they even try to counter this overwhelming physical evidence? The spatter, the number of blows, the trazodone?
Well, they largely tried to discredit the expert methodologies, challenge the interpretations, but the physical evidence itself was just incredibly compelling. They focused heavily on the legal argument that the prosecution failed to prove malice.
Can you explain malice for the listener?
Sure. Malice is a key ingredient for second-degree murder. It basically means acting with wickedness or extreme recklessness or depraved indifference to human life. But it doesn't require the sort of cool, calculated planning needed for first-degree murder. The defense argued that if Tom Martens was acting in the heat of passion, protecting his daughter, then malice didn't exist legally.
Despite the defense's technical arguments, Thomas Martens actually took the stand. What did he say, and how did that end up hurting his case?
He stuck to his original story, walked in, saw Jason with his arm around Molly's throat, heard him threaten, "I am going to kill her." He claimed necessity, fear for his daughter's life, fear for his own.
But the cross-examination was tough.
Very. Under cross-examination, he made some crucial admissions that really shredded his credibility. Martens admitted he had never witnessed or even been told of any previous domestic violence incidents between Jason and Molly before that night.
So not rushing in to save her from a known abuser.
Exactly. It completely undercut that narrative.
And he also admitted his own personal feelings towards Jason.
Yes. He admitted he'd advised Molly to seek a divorce because, in his view, Jason did not measure up to her standard. And he personally stated, under oath, that he hated his son-in-law.
Wow. Saying you hated the man you just beat to death.
That admission of hatred, combined with the forensic proof of such excessive, brutal violence, It just reinforced the prosecution's argument for malice. It suggested Tom Martens wasn't just acting out of protection, but maybe out of opportunity, fueled by this deep-seated contempt.
And Molly, did she testify?
No. Molly Martens exercised her constitutional right to silence. She did not testify at the first trial. So despite all the defense efforts, that first jury in 2017, they were not persuaded by the self-defense story at all. The strength of the forensic evidence just made their decision pretty quick, pretty decisive.
Yeah, after less than 4 hours of deliberation, that was August 9th, 2017, the jury found both Thomas Martens and Molly Martens Corbett unanimously guilty of second-degree murder.
And they were sentenced accordingly. A minimum of 20 years, maximum of 25 years in prison. That swift verdict really confirmed the jury just didn't buy the story that Jason attacked Molly, or that the incredible level of force used could ever be justified as self-defense.
And jurors commented afterwards, didn't they, about Molly's demeanor?
They did. Some jurors later commented they found Molly seemed highly manipulative. They noted she only really displayed strong emotion, crying loudly when evidence about the children was being discussed, not when viewing the horrific photos of Jason's body.
So justice seemed served at that point. But this is where the legal system introduces that profound technicality centered, again, on the children's testimony that derailed the whole thing.
This is the really tragic turning point in the legal story. In 2021, the North Carolina Supreme Court, in a close 4-3 decision, ruled to quash those convictions.
Right.
They ordered a completely new trial.
And the reason wasn't lack of evidence.
No, not at all. It was a procedural error related to evidence admissibility. The trial judge had excluded certain statements the children made to investigators right after the death. The very statements Jack later retracted, saying he'd been coached by Molly.
So why were those statements excluded initially? It seems confusing if they were potentially relevant.
Well, it likely boiled down to rules of evidence, probably related to hearsay and reliability. Given the children's age at the time, the trauma, and the high likelihood of immediate coaching or coercion, especially since Jack did later recant, the trial judge deemed those initial statements unreliable or inadmissible.
But the Supreme Court disagreed.
The majority on the Supreme Court decided that even if those statements were suspect, the defense should have been allowed to present them to the jury. They argued that excluding them violated the Martens' constitutional right to present a complete defense, that it unduly prejudiced their self-defense claim. So, new trial granted.
That technical reversal must have put the prosecution in an incredibly difficult position, facing a whole new trial, potentially years later, where the defense could now use those initial retracted statements.
It was a massive gamble for the state. A new trial is expensive, emotionally draining for the victim's family, and there's always the risk of acquittal. If the Martens were acquitted the second time around, that would be it. Justice denied completely.
But then the children, Jack and Sarah, stepped up again.
They did. Now older, teenagers, clearly more articulate and understanding the stakes. They stated publicly they were willing to testify again against the Martenses, specifically if the defense tried to use those earlier retracted statements. They were ready to expose the coaching, the manipulation, in excruciating detail right there in court.
Which brings us to the plea deal in 2023. A compromise, really, to avoid the risk of another murder conviction for the Martens.
Precisely. Faced with the prospect of Jack and Sarah's powerful new testimony and potentially the same second-degree murder conviction again, the Martens decided to take a deal. Molly Martens Corbett pled no contest, and Thomas Martens pled guilty to the greatly reduced charge of voluntary manslaughter.
Okay, let's clarify for the listener. Voluntary manslaughter is very different from second-degree murder in North Carolina law, right?
It's a crucial legal distinction. Second-degree murder, which the first jury found, requires proof of malice, that wickedness or recklessness we talked about. Voluntary manslaughter, however, is defined as an intentional killing done without malice, usually committed in the heat of passion, resulting from adequate provocation.
So, by accepting this plea,
By accepting the plea, the Martens essentially conceded they intentionally used excessive force that led to Jason's death, but they legally denied acting with the malice or premeditation required for murder. They admitted responsibility for the death, but framed it as an overreaction in the heat of the moment, not a malicious killing.
and the sentence reflected that huge reduction, which must have infuriated Jason's family.
Absolutely. They were sentenced to between 51 and 74 months. But because they'd already served over 4 years while waiting for the appeal and retrial process,
They only had to serve a little more time.
just an additional 7 months in prison, which led to their release in June 2024. A stark contrast to the original 2025-year sentence.
That final sentencing hearing, though, it did provide a moment for the victims to finally speak their truth, unfiltered.
It was incredibly emotional, by all accounts. The defense, even at that late stage, was still presenting new evidence, trying to bolster the narrative of Jason's alleged abuse photos, audio recordings, arguing Molly's main fear was losing custody, making a planned killing less likely.
But Jack and Sarah spoke.
They did, in person. Jack, now 19, and Sarah, 17. They delivered these powerful, devastating victim impact statements directly to the Martenses and the court.
Sarah's statement really hit hard, connecting back to the manipulation she experienced as a child.
She described years of intensive therapy she needed because her words, her statements as a traumatized young child, had been deliberately twisted and weaponized to help the people who killed her father evade punishment. She said Molly showed zero remorse, took off her wedding ring almost immediately after Jason's death, and cruelly told Sarah, an 8-year-old, to just get over it.
Just awful. And Jack's statement.
Jack called Molly a monster. He said she had abused him emotionally and psychologically and had actively weaponized his own coerced statements in her effort to get away with killing his dad. He used this really powerful phrase, saying he felt like he was just a piece on her chessboard.
How did Molly react to that?
Reports say Molly sobbed loudly throughout their statements, and at one point apparently just laid her face down on the defense table as the children delivered these incredibly painful truths. So, as you can imagine, the release of Molly and Tom Martens in June 2024 sparked pretty intense public outcry, especially from people who were involved in the original investigation and trial.
Yeah, the former Davidson County Sheriff David Grice, he was quite vocal, wasn't he?
He was. He commented publicly that he felt the Martens got off with a slap on the wrist. His take was basically that the family had the financial resources to just keep appealing, spend enough money on appeals until the courts got worn down and accepted their last appeal. Kind of implying the system was worn down rather than convinced.
And Jason Corbett's daughter, Sarah, how does she react publicly?
Sarah expressed, understandably, profound disappointment in the final outcome. But she also maintained her certainty that justice, in the moral sense, was on her side. She stated that if the Martens had faced a retrial, she was confident they would have been found guilty again, pointing to their acceptance of the plea deal as evidence they knew they couldn't win.
And the family emphasized the manipulation.
The Corbett family consistently highlighted how Molly Martens had relentlessly put Jack and Sarah into the center of her bid to evade justice with a web of lies. That weaponization of the children remained central to their view of the injustice.
And now the narrative complexity continues, doesn't it? Because the Martens themselves are actively participating in shaping their own public image.
That's right. There was a Netflix documentary released, A Deadly American Marriage, in May 2025. And it features interviews with both Molly and Tom Martens.
Which gives them a huge platform.
A huge platform to present their version of events, yes. It raises all sorts of interesting questions about, victimhood narratives, self-promotion after conviction, and how it further muddies the public perception of a case that already had conflicting stories.
But it's important to note, even people involved in the prosecution used that documentary platform to reinforce their view of the calculation involved.
Yes, the former district attorney, Alan Martin, he actually theorized in the documentary about Molly's possible original intent. He suggested she might have planned to stage the domestic incident, not necessarily to kill Jason, but specifically to get grounds to apply for a protective order.
And getting a protective order would help with custody.
Exactly. Securing a protective order could have allowed her to file for emergency custody of the children. Martin's theory suggests a highly calculated, pre-planned action, maybe aimed at custody rather than murder initially, but one that tragically and fatally escalated when Thomas Martens intervened with such overwhelming, unnecessary force.
So when you step back, this case is just such a painful example. You have these deeply disturbing facts. The brutal forensic evidence, the trazodone, the signs that the scene was altered.
Undeniable physical evidence.
Right. And yet all of that can be obscured or at least mitigated legally by procedural missteps like those excluded children statements and by a really aggressive, well-funded legal strategy from the Martens family.
We've unpacked the financial motives, the alleged systematic manipulation of the children, the blood spatter evidence that just shattered the self-defense story, that bizarre calmness of Tom Martens on the 911 call.
Yeah.
All of that taken together, it paints a picture so far removed from a clean, necessary act of self-defense.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, maybe something for you, the listener, to consider is the implication this case has for our understanding of the legal system. The first jury, the one that heard all the primary evidence back in 2017, they clearly did not believe the self-defense argument was plausible. The forensics suggested the scene was tampered with.
Yet the final outcome was this greatly reduced charge of voluntary manslaughter and a very short, effective sentence, secured only through a plea deal prompted by a technical appeal. What does that reveal about the capacity of our justice system to achieve real closure? Especially for victims like Jack and Sarah, who literally had their childhood memories, their trauma, weaponized against them in the process.
It really leaves you pondering that significant, sometimes vast, difference between legal finality, the case being closed, and actual justice being served.